Hello, it's Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter here. I've been making quilts for Project Linus, the charity, and in this video I'm making some child size quilts. First of all, come into the kitchen with me and we'll take a look at the fabric that I've chosen. So I'm going to do a 36-inch square and possibly consider a border around the edge. I'm going to use this fabric that I got in the charity shop a few weeks ago as my main fabric, and I've cut 12 squares of that, and then 3 of each from 8 coordinating fabrics. From my stash, I've got recycled fabric, which is all 100% cotton. This is 2 checks, 2 stripes, 2 plains, a plain, a geometric and a stripe. Let me show you those in grayscale and you can see how well they go well together. So I've cut 36 6.5-inch squares. This quilt will have 1/4-inch seam allowance throughout. I've just laid out the design on my bed. It's a 6 by 6-inch block. It's random pattern. I've interspersed the florals and I've checked it in grayscale so that there's a good mix. To sew it, I'm going to use a mercerised Sylko vintage cotton thread. This is a 50 weight cotton. I'll use the same in the thread and the bobbin. This is number 36. I'm going to call this one Damask Rose. I don't adjust the tension or the stitch length on this machine. I leave well alone. This is around about a 2 1/4 to 2.5, and that's fine for this project. But good lighting is essential. I've got a good overhead light and I've added the LED lighting here. I've got a variety of texture. This is quite a thin cotton. I've got linen. I've got a very thin stripe in this one, almost see-through. And I also had a textured seersucker cotton. The thicker fabric here is Oxford cloth. You can see it's a tighter weave of cotton. It's thicker. It would have been a warmer cotton shirt, and this is probably taken from a man's shirt. I mark each row with a post-it note attached with a safety pin, and on the first one I mark it that this is the top of the quilt. Sew the squares on the right side with right sides together and use whatever tool you need, whether it's your presser foot. Here you'll see I've got a piece of tape just to denote where a 1/4 inch seam would be. That's the distance between the needle and the edge of the fabric. And now I'm just going to iron. I'm going to iron the odd ones to the right and the even ones to the left so that the seams lie flat. To connect the rows together, I'm going to take number 1 and number 2 and place them right sides together, one on top of the other. And I'm going to pin these in place. And because I've pressed the seams in opposite directions, it means I've got 4 pieces of fabric at the most to sew over. And that will help the seam not only meet at the join, but lie as flat as I can get it. I'm going to continue along and add on each row together until I've got my square. That's how your patches should look if they're meeting up correctly. Uploading this video a few weeks later, I started losing my voice at this point, and this was at the beginning of my laryngitis, which developed into quite a nasty chest infection. So for a few segments, I'm just going to put text to guide you. Now iron it. To prepare the quilt sandwich, I used my ironing board to bring it up to a working height for me, which eases my back muscles. I find it much helpful. And I use a simple white cotton on the back and a soft feel polyester wadding, and it's all with wrong sides together and pinned. I want to create a lattice effect with my quilting. So from the inside of the border, I'm drawing lines with an erasable ink pen and doing, first of all, a diagonal stitch 1.5 inches wide. Then I'm going to come back in the opposite direction to create the lattice effect. You'll find it helpful if you roll the excess fabric into a sausage at both sides. This needs to go into the throat of the machine. Using an extension table will help take the weight of your fabric. As I sew from the midline out to the right, this will get heavier. See that I haven't changed my presser foot. If you're using a modern domestic machine, you might prefer to change to a walking foot here and do a back stitch at the beginning and the end of each row. My old Singer sewing machine doesn't like to do that, so I need to sew in all those loose ends later when I'm watching the TV. It's important that you keep your work flat. I use my left hand to help do this, either in an L shape like this or sometimes like this. My right hand is on the crankshaft. It is a real pleasure to be sewing these, especially on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I'm listening to a podcast while I do it. At the moment, I'm listening to Lady Colin Campbell. You can see the quilting on the back. It's 1.5 inches apart, so it actually would be okay to call that quilted. However, I have marked the front because I think that lattice quilting looks much prettier. So I've just marked it. I'm going to repeat the same process, just coming down in the opposite direction. And then once I've done that, I'll iron all these erasable ink marks out. To secure the border, I'm going to do a stitch on the inside edge, and I'm going to use this outer edge to line up with the fabric. That way I'll have an equidistance line of stitching all the way around. And I'm going to sew a line of stitching here right on this inside edge, just to neaten it off on the back. Making these smaller quilts is a good way to develop your skills. If you like doing it on a smaller scale, you can then transfer those skills to a larger scale one with more confidence. To trim off the excess, I'm going to use an Easyrule and my small rotary cutter. You could also do this with a pair of scissors. What I'm doing with the Easyrule is taking this 3-inch marked line, and I've placed it on the fold of the beginning of the border. And to stop it from moving, I'm going to use a dumbbell up here. And anything beyond this line is going to be excess. It's going to be cut off with the rotary cutter. Now, when I come to squaring it, I also need to make sure that this line matches up squarely to get a square corner. Binding, I've used the same fabric and I've cut 2.5-inch strips and I've sewn them together. This gives me 176 inches and I need a minimum of 160 inches with some overlap, so this should be enough. Starting part way down the left side of the quilt, I'm going to start adding the border, putting all the raw edges together. I'm going to pin and start with leaving a tail so I can meet up the ends later. I showed how I did this on my last video. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam. And as usual, I'm finishing my trim on the reverse by hand with a small neat slip stitch, but I'm doing this with 2 layers of cotton because I think there might be a little bit of rough and tumble here if it's for a child. And on the front, it's not visible. Here it is. The final quilt measures 42-inch square. As we look closely, we can see the lattice effect on the front and then on the back. It's nice, soft and pliable, and I'm sure a child will really enjoy that. Let me show you another design that I made using the same group of fabrics. The second quilt uses more or less the same fabrics, but I've created half square triangles in this design. Separated them into piles of dark and light, and I've got a mixture of checks, stripes and plains and florals, and I'm going to put one dark and one light together and sew them together to make the square. Now sew the triangles together, right sides together, down the long edge. This is the bias edge, and if you pull it, it'll stretch. Be careful that you don't stretch it as you sew, and I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam throughout. Now press to set the seam, iron with the seam to the dark side, square up using the diagonal mark on your ruler and trim down to 6.5 inches. These blocks now measure 6.5 inch because I've cut them down, and I'm going to sew them together again with a 1/4 inch seam, and you can see I've marked them in rows. As usual, I'll sew them across on the rows and then add the rows together, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, going down the quilt. I'll show you the design I've laid out on my bed. When you pin it together, you'll be able to nest those seams, but some of those seams are really quite bulky, and just by my fingernail I'll show you where exactly I'm wanting to lay my stitch. Just here. It measures 36 by 42, and I haven't added an additional border. I've done the same thing with the trim, and I've quilted it with the same filling. But here you'll see that I've quilted just inside the stitch line on the square, and then in the middle I've done a small X, which shows on the back like this. That means that within every 6 inch there is something to keep the quilting in place. Now both of these are ready to go to Project Linus, and I hope that they're enjoyed by a child. I don't know what age range I've made these for. I have no idea who they'll go to, but I hope somebody enjoys them. This is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter. Thanks for joining me for this project, and come back and join me again soon, won't you? Bye.